So now I'd like to talk about what you do with anthropological data, because data are just numbers, words on pages. They don't actually say anything themselves. An emic perspective, even when recorded, isn't good enough for anthropology. That's an anecdote. That's just something that you heard from somebody else. Your observation is not good enough. That's just something that your eyes can be deceiving you, right? You may not understand the full context. So, ethnographic data collection is the raw materials that anthropologists use to try and understand the way culture works and the way individual particular cultures do things, how they approach their universals, and then importantly tries to come up with generalizations that are useful to everybody, right? So in the early days of anthropology, there was really one theoretical game in town, and that's what we're talking about today, is theory, and the development of theory from the 19th century to present day. Now, I should point out before we get started, that we're going to go through a list of different theoretical approaches, and some of them are outdated and probably shouldn't be used, like the first one I'm going to approach, which is unilinear evolutionism. Now, while some of them are outdated, some of the earlier ones are still useful, and we'll see them coming back again and again, in fact. I'll be presenting them as individual theoretical perspectives, but that doesn't mean that you can't actually fuse some of them together. These aren't always mutually exclusive. They can work together, and anthropologists are always trying to find a tug and a push and a pull to try and find where their theoretical perspective lies. Now, the data collection, the data should be done well if your methodology is sound, but interpretations and theories are always going to change. So the framework that you fit all of these facts and data into is going to be improving through time, and we will see that as I just describe this. There's probably never any perfect theory, but you find something that you think makes sense, and you make an argument, and you put your data into that. That may get revised in the future. You may someone may disagree with the way you've interpreted things, and you may say, okay, yes, you're right. I think that this is a better way to understand this. That is the normal process of doing anthropology. So when anthropology first started getting used as a discipline in academia, this was in the 19th century, and this was an age when European and American scientists were trying to apply the scientific method to studying other humans. And they were most interested in not themselves, because they thought they understood themselves. They were interested in going out and collecting information from the wider world. And while that's very useful, there was a general notion that white Western Europeans and Americans were the top of culture, that this is what everybody else should be. If given enough time, given enough energy, given enough effort, given enough intelligence, everybody would get there. And if they weren't, there was some deficit that they had. Now that's racism, it's scientific racism, and we've talked about this in the past, about scientific racism in biological anthropology, but it also applies to cultural anthropology. And so the theory of unilinear evolutionism is the simple concept that cultures evolve. We've seen this in biology already, but cultures evolve through time. And this unilinear aspect of it is that there's one direction, that it's always getting better, it's always progressing, it's always improving. And Edward Tyler offered an early definition of culture and proposed that it could be studied scientifically, and this started the path of anthropologists trying to find scientific ways to establish how this unilinear evolution operated. Now, the problem with this is that it's assuming that the best culture is a particular one. And that's an assumption too far. We've now understood, and we've actually seen in other classes, that historically, archaeologically, progress isn't necessarily the same thing as development. So when things develop into other things, like for instance, hunting and gathering into farming and herding, that's not necessarily progress. That's not necessarily an improvement. So hunting and gathering way of life actually has a much broader diet, more leisure time, healthier lifestyle. There are some drawbacks of that. You have smaller populations, but you also, as a consequence, have less exploitation of one another. You don't have the hierarchies that put people into ranks, and you don't have differential access to resources and goods and wealth. You don't have property, you don't have laws as such. So you have reduced freedoms, you have reduced health, you have new diseases, you have new restrictions, and you have a worse diet when you move into a more complex culture that agriculture requires. That is the opposite of what the early archaeologists and early anthropologists thought about this. They thought that progress was taking place as time moved forward. This is what we call teleology, that you see the endpoint and you're moving towards that endpoint through time. But there is no real end to time. So unilinear means that there's one way that things evolve, only one way. They're always getting better, and they're always going towards what is perceived as the teleology, the endpoint, which was perceived in the 19th century to be 19th century European and American culture. This is largely rejected by anthropologists, actually almost universally rejected by anthropologists today, that there is only one way to evolve culturally, that this is not really a very useful way of looking at cultures, that they are if they're not as complex as this other one, that they're not as good as that other one. That's been rejected. But as we'll see in a moment, evolution is a thing, and cultural evolution is also a thing. And so while unilinear evolution may be incorrect, there was a revival of evolution in later years. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, as I said, unilinear evolutionism was the only game in town for many years until, once again, our friend Franz Boas from Columbia University, who was trying to inject a little bit more objective and scientific approach to anthropology and the study of humans, and he started to question this unilinear evolutionary approach. And his idea was what we call historical particularism. Now, unilinear evolutionism can be considered a sort of a universal explanatory system, that every culture fits into this unilinear evolutionary model. They're all somewhere on this scale. Franz Boas said, no, actually every culture is on their own timeline, on their own individual particular history, and they can't even really be compared. Now, his idea was probably a step too far, and if you think of it as like a pendulum, that on one end you have unitary evolutionism that is on one end tipping too far to a universal explanation. Well, Boas swung it the entire opposite direction and said, no, there is no way we can even come up with generalities, that every culture is particular to itself. It has its own particular explanation of how it got to be that way. And so you can't even compare Western European culture to any other culture, or you can't compare this particular group of people to this other group of people. This had the benefit of destroying, essentially, unilinear evolutionism and taking away the primacy and priority of Western European and American culture overall. And it introduced to us the concept of cultural relativism, in fact, that everything needed to be understood in its own, from its own perspective. But the foundations of this started to crumble a little bit when people started to bring up the idea that, well, there's never really been a culture that's existed on its own. That if you want to be historical particularist in your perspective, and then you have to treat these cultures as isolated little bubbles that only have their own history and don't share anything with anybody else. And we know that that's not the case. This is the concept of diffusion that is cultural borrowing. So diffusion and diffusionism is something that started to take hold in the early 20th century as a challenge to historical particularism, that we actually could see that there was influence from neighboring regions, even from far-flung regions, that cultures were borrowing, which meant that they are not entirely independent of one another, and so not entirely historically particular. So while on one end there was unilinear evolutionism, swung around to historical particularism, diffusion acknowledged that actually somewhere in the middle is probably closer to the case. That cultures are neither on a single timeline, but they're also not completely isolated from one another and acting independently of one another, and that there is cultural borrowing taking place. Another approach that early ethnographers, people like Branislaw Malinowski, a very big name, and also Reginald Radcliffe Brown, they both came up with nearly simultaneously two different forms of approaching the study of cultures when you go and observe them directly. Branislaw Malinowski, who was working in the Trobriand Islands and elsewhere in Melanesia, very famous for collecting information. He's sort of what you typically would think of an early 20th century anthropologist, going into a culture, taking notes, living with them for years, learning their language, participating in them, but of course dressing in your very European clothes. And he was a pretty important figure for anthropology. He was very Germanically minded, and very rigorous and scientific in his way of thinking, and he saw cultural practices taking place, and he was trying to understand them in their own context. So he was trying to employ cultural relativism, and he saw that certain cultural practices, this cultural practice related to another cultural practice. So he saw that one practice was a function of another. So, for instance, something like marriage, if you take on its own, it addresses a universal, right? So procreation for creating an offspring is a universal. If we stop procreating, we're gone, right? So we have to do this. How do you do it? Well, you can look at marriage as an isolated practice in a culture, as one thing. But even in our own culture, it's not unrelated to the concept of marriage, or of property, or of kinship and family. And so what he saw was this is like a culture as a giant clockwork with gears that intermeshed and linked into one another. And he saw these all as functions that held together as part of that culture. And so this is what we call functionalism. And this is where he saw that humans, in their need to address their universal needs, developed customs to fulfill those needs as functions of one another. So they all fit in together. And so you look at that individual particular history of the development of the culture, and you can see all of these elements rising together. Another aspect of this was, for instance, structural functionalism, which is promoted by Radcliffe Brown and others, such as Edward Evans Pritchard, another very big name in anthropology, called this structural functionalism, which was not exactly the same as Malinowski's, Malinowski saw this as rising up from the universal needs that in other words, culture rose from the universal, whereas Radcliffe Brown and Evans Pritchard seemed to think that culture existed down and coming down, top down, towards addressing those needs. And in fact, the customs that you see in a culture maintain these functions. And so the whole purpose of culture is to maintain the functionalism of that social structure. So in other words, in a very basic way of describing it, Malinowski tended to be bottom up, and Evans Pritchard and Radcliffe Brown tended to be top down. There's an argument against functionalism that this is very mechanistic, that this is something that doesn't really allow for individual agency, individual people to have their own opinions and their own individual practices, and that is a valid critique. At the same time, you might actually find some use in functionalism. I certainly do. I think that there's some truth to be seen in that. But as I said before, you can take elements of functionalism and not buy into it entirely. You can actually say, okay, here's a functionalist aspect of culture as I'm studying it, but maybe it's not quite so mechanistic as someone like Evans Pritchard would describe it. That's okay too. So another theoretical framework is called configurationalism. And this was Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, who are both students, protégés of Franz Boas. And so they were coming from this tradition of historical particularism, but they recognized diffusionism. And they actually took historical particularism out of that extreme mode and back into maybe a little bit more middle ground area. And they called this configurationalism. And they saw that actually traits that came from the outside, when they entered into a community, they would be what they called indigenized. And so they were trying to understand how change occurred in culture. And we've been looking at cultures as blocks, as units that are unchangeable. But when you start to include diffusionism into this, you are accepting that actually cultures are not static things, but they are in constant motion. And so Ruth Benedict stressed that culture traits were patterned or integrated in certain ways, and Margaret Mead focused on various patterns of enculturation. So, stressing that people are actually plastic and changeable in their human nature already. In about the 1950s, anthropologists started to realize that maybe they had thrown the baby out with the bathwater in rejecting unilinear evolutionism, and that maybe evolutionary theory was maybe not quite so wrong. The unilinear part was, for sure, to place every culture on the same evolutionary track, assuming that progress is taking place. These are mistakes, these are errors. But does evolution occur? Yes. We've seen that biologically and socially. That also takes place. That things change through time, and they react to stresses, outside stresses, and they adapt to those stresses. So from the 1950s in the US, Leslie White and very important anthropologist Julian Stewart argued that cultural evolutionism had been unfairly dismissed. They started to reestablish this, which is called neo-evolutionary theory, or neo-evolutionism. And so this looked at, as we saw in earlier chapters with biology, tried to understand causality. Why do cultures emerge this way? Not just describing them, but saying what are the natural selective forces that have channeled human behavior into this way. And so evolutionary theory can be used not just to describe, but to actually explain causality, and that's important as well. Now, we've seen this already in terms of archaeology, but another theory that starts to become prominent in sort of mid-20th century is cultural materialism. Now, this is going to be very important when we start to look at things like economics and politics. That I've mentioned this before, that the universals everyone has, but that doesn't mean that universal resources are evenly distributed around the world. We live in a material world, a real world. And so what materials you have is going to influence your particulars. So if you don't have a lot of water, that's going to be a precious commodity. If you have too much water, that's something you need to manage and get away from you to prevent flooding and that sort of thing. So although universals of drinking water are the same for every human, the abundance or the lack thereof of these materials are going to influence the outcome of a way a culture develops. So we saw this in terms of the 19th century, where Karl Marx was a historical materialist, and he saw that you could see the means of production was the way that you obtain the things that you need to survive. So your technology, your objects, your materials, your structures, your houses, that sort of a thing. And your mode of production was the social organization that arose from that means of production. And then there's the third tier, which is ideology, which holds that mode of production together and puts it into your brain as something that is right and proper. So cultural